No, I turned it off. I muted it. I was on that whole time. I'm glad you didn't turn it up then. How's everybody today? Hope everyone had a really wonderful Thanksgiving time together. We're involved right now in a study of the life of David, and so let's kick right into that again this morning. So there were these three men who were talking about their wives. And the first one said, when we got married, I told my wife in no uncertain terms that from now on she would have to do all the cooking. And the first day I saw nothing. And the second day I saw nothing. But the third day she fixed me a feast. Table was spread, even had dessert. Second one said, well, I sat my wife down and told her that from now on she'd have to do all the shopping and all the cleaning. First day I saw nothing. Second day I saw nothing again. Third day the house was spick and span and the shelves were all stocked with food. Third guy said, well, I gave my wife a stern look and told her that from now on she'd have to do all the cooking, all the shopping, and all the house cleaning. First day I saw nothing. Second day I saw nothing. Third day I could just begin to see a little bit out of my left eye. That's how life is sometimes. It hits us right between the eyes, and we come crashing back to reality. And man, do we see that in the life of David. In the aftermath of his killing of Goliath. And often the most difficult trials come right after the greatest victories. Boy, do we not see that in the life of Elijah? You remember Elijah and the prophets of Baal, that contest, and immediately after that, I mean, that's his great victory, and right after that, man, he's running for his life. And so it's really a good thing that God only gives us one day at a time, isn't it? But my guess is that many people, when they think about David, think that he went straight from the Goliath event to reigning in Israel as king. But the truth is, after the giant, David enters into one of the darkest, deepest, longest valleys in his life. We know, Scripture tells us he was 30 when he became king. And most scholars think he was in his teens when he killed Goliath. So we're talking about 12 to 15 years that he lives in this dark valley. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Do you ever struggle with jealousy? I think most of us do, if we're honest. Most of us struggle with jealousy to some degree. And when you do, or if you do you feel better when you're in that place? Are you more joyful when you're in that place? No, it never makes us more joyful. And so in today's passage, we're going to be taught this simple truth. That love brings us closer to people, while jealousy and fear drive us apart. And again, we're going to see that in the characters in our story today. So last week, we looked at the David and Goliath story. David gains instant popularity in Israel. He becomes a national hero overnight. And you know, there's very few people who can take this kind of fame, this instant fame, and do well with it. How many times have we seen the tragic stories of some young athlete or some young actor in Hollywood who have this instant success and they end up crashing? But not David. And why not? Because David had the heart. He had the right heart. And God's going to use David to be the greatest king in the history of Israel. In fact, David's going to be the king by which every other king of Israel is going to be measured. But in order for God to use him in that way, he's going to have to shape him. He's going to have to sharpen him. And we get to watch. We get to watch as David enters into this crucible of pain and suffering for 12 to 15 years. The first thing that we read about after David slays Goliath is that Saul refuses to allow him to go home. So in verse 2 of chapter 18, it says, "From that day Saul kept David with him and did not let him return home to his family." And then verse 5 says, "Whatever mission Saul sent him on, David was so successful that Saul gave him a high rank in the army. This pleased all the troops and Saul's officers as well." So David, here he is, the champion of champions, the slayer of giants. And yet, he's going to go wherever Saul sends him for a dozen plus years. He's going to be loyally submissive. And you know, one of the surprising things about this is he's loyally submissive to a man who's out to kill him, to a man who's going to have him hiding in caves, and yet David continues to live in submission to him, as we're going to see as this story unfolds. But the result of all of this is that David prospers. Four times in this chapter we're told that David prospered. He simply did what God led him to do, and he was blessed as a result of it. Meanwhile, standing in the shadows is another young man. Verse 1 of chapter 18 says, "After David had finished talking with Saul, Jonathan, which is Saul's son, Jonathan became one in spirit with David, and he loved him as himself." So Jonathan and David enjoy this special friendship. I mean, they are BFFs before we use that term, okay? And it's really remarkable if you think about it. Why is this so remarkable that these guys are so close? Jonathan's next in line to be king from a human standpoint, and yet God's blessing David. God knew that David was going to need a loyal friend to walk beside him through this dark valley he's going to be in. And actually, if anyone in this story has a right to be jealous, if anyone has a right to be afraid of David, it's Jonathan. But never in this entire account, never do we ever see a sign of pettiness or envy or anger. And they become kindred spirits, best friends. Now, I've got to assume that Jonathan is older than David. I've always thought of them as being the same age, but we're going to see an event in just a moment that happened long before David, well, I say long before, but it happened before David even killed Goliath. So I'm assuming Jonathan, as a soldier in Saul's army, he must be older than David by a few years. But he was no doubt impressed with David's faith. David's the one that went up against Goliath. But Jonathan had shown significant bravery in an event that we read about before the Goliath event. Let's look at that one. He leads an attack on the Philistines back in chapters 13 and 14. And here's what it says. "One day, Jonathan, son of Saul, said to his young armor-bearer, 'Come, let's go over to the Philistine outpost on the other side.' But he did not tell his father." Now, if you skip down to verse 6, it says, "Jonathan said to his young armor-bearer, 'Come, let's go over to the outpost of those uncircumcised men. Perhaps the Lord will act on our behalf. Nothing can hinder the Lord from saving, whether by many or by few.'" Sounds like a lot of faith, doesn't it? Do all that you have in mind, his armor bearer said. Go ahead, I'm with you, heart and soul. Jonathan said, come on then, we'll cross over toward them and let them see us. If they say to us, wait there until we come to you, we'll stay where we are and not go up to them. But if they say, come up to us, we'll climb up, because that will be our sign that the Lord has given them into our hands. So both of them showed themselves to the Philistine outpost. Look, said the Philistines, the Hebrews are crawling out of the holes they were hiding in. The men of the outpost shouted to Jonathan and his armor bearer, come up to us and we'll teach you a lesson. So Jonathan said to his armor bearer, climb up with me. The Lord has given them into the hand of Israel. Jonathan climbed up using his hands and feet with his armor bearer right behind him. The Philistines fell before Jonathan, and his armor bearer followed and killed behind him. In that first attack, Jonathan and his armor bearer killed some 20 men in an area of about half an acre. Would you say that this faith, that this bravery would be similar to David slaying Goliath? I would say so. Which leaves me in a quandary then. What happened to Jonathan when Goliath was strutting around? I mean, if he was brave enough to do this, what happened? Well, we don't know the answer to that. In fact, KC probably was thinking of that question, because it would have been a question I don't have an answer for. I would think that would be giving Saul too much credit at that point. but I don't know. So let's look at the next passage then in verse 3. And Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. Jonathan took off the robe he was wearing and gave it to David, along with his tunic and even his sword and his bow and his belt. So Jonathan gives David all of these things: his robe, his armor, his sword, his bow, his belt, which were symbolic of Jonathan's position as heir to the throne. There's an interesting thing to me about this sword, because back in chapter 13 and verse 22, we learned that in the entire army of Israel, there's only two people that have a sword and a spear: Saul and Jonathan. And so Jonathan is giving David his sword, which is symbolic. Do you realize what he's saying by doing that? The heir to the throne's the one that gets the sword. He's recognizing that David's going to be the heir to the throne. And again, if anyone has a right to be jealous with David, it's Jonathan. But he seems to understand early on that David is going to be the next king. And you know what? This is what's amazing to me. He's just fine with that. 1,000 years later, Paul is going to write these words in Romans chapter 12 and verse 10. Be devoted to one another in love. Honor one another above yourselves. And in Philippians 2 and verse 3, he says, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves. I think sometimes we read over those words and we don't think of the significance of what's being said. Because you see, it's not even enough, according to Paul, it's not even enough that we don't mind other people receiving honor. Paul says that we should prefer that other people receive honor. See a difference? And that's really hard, isn't it? We don't get this unless we've had children or grandchildren because we want our children and grandchildren to have more than what we've had. And I'm not talking about even necessarily materially, but we want them to have more and better than what we have, right? And so we do understand the concept. Well, we're going to see this even deeper next week. But it is sad and it is shameful to me what the homosexual community has done to tarnish this story. Because they claim that David and Jonathan were homosexual lovers. It's sad that two men can't just actually appreciate and love each other and have a close friendship without being accused of something like this. It distorts the beauty of this deep friendship. Well, the plot thickens. It thickens as we read of the people of Israel's reaction to David's success. We move from Jonathan's love for David to Saul's jealousy of David. And so in verse 5 it says, whatever mission Saul sent him on, David was so successful that Saul gave him a high rank in the army. This pleased all the troops and Saul's officers as well. So right away, Saul begins giving David difficult tasks. And everything David does, he does with excellence. And he becomes a national hero. In fact, in some archaeological digs, they have discovered David bobbleheads over. I'm just kidding. But, in his day, if they had them, they would have had David bobbleheads. They would have had David action figures. He's so successful that Saul gives him this high rank in the army, which pleased everyone except for one. Saul isn't pleased. Why not? Because he's jealous. Yes, Jonathan was in line to be king. That's what I'm saying. It's extreme. Yeah, it's amazing the humility that he shows. But I want to share with you some problems that come with jealousy. The first one being that jealousy prevents us from taking pleasure in others' successes. In James chapter 3 and verse 14, James wrote, "But if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. Such wisdom does not come from heaven, but is earthly, unspiritual, demonic." I want you to notice that jealousy and envy are connected with being demonic. For where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder and every evil practice. So it prevents us from taking pleasure in other people's successes. But secondly, jealousy robs us of the joy of our own successes. Listen to this. When the men were returning home after David had killed the Philistine, the women came out from all the towns of Israel to meet King Saul with singing and dancing, with joyful songs and with timbrels and lyres. And as they danced, they sang, "Saul has slain his thousands and David his tens of thousands." And Saul was very angry. This refrain displeased him greatly. They've credited David with tens of thousands, he thought, but me with only thousands. What more can he get but the kingdom? And from that time on, Saul kept a close eye on David. Let's understand, these women are singing a song of poetry, and it's exaggerated. David hadn't killed tens of thousands. Saul hadn't killed thousands at this point. It's poetry. The ordering of it does suggest that the ladies are saying, Saul's really good, but man, David's something else. And this kind of adulation, as I've already said, would be disastrous for most people. It would go to their heads. It would lead to all kinds of problems, but we don't see that with David because David's got the right heart. But Saul can't even enjoy the adulation it's being shown to him too, right? He's coming back into town, and these people, they're not just celebrating David. They're celebrating Saul and David. And as I said, it's obviously exaggeration. But don't they have a good reason for exalting David over Saul at this point? Because what's this really about? When they've come back to town, it's about they just slew the giant. And if Saul had wanted that highest adulation, guess what? Saul needed to show up on the battlefield and take care of the giant. But it's David that did. And so Saul's conclusion then is this: what more can he get but the kingdom? Perhaps Saul's beginning to recognize that David is the one whom God has chosen to replace him. He's a little bit slower in understanding that than some other people are. Teddy Roosevelt once said this. He says, comparison is the thief of joy. Can you see that? Well, it's up there. Comparison is the thief of joy. It's hard for us to count our blessings when we're busy trying to count other people's blessings. Comparison is the thief of joy. Isn't that where Saul is right here? And here it appears that we have the turning point in Saul's relationship with David, because it says in verse 9, and from that time on, Saul kept a close eye on David. What David had done, what had he done that warranted suspicion? What had he done that warranted mistreatment? Nothing. It's not fair. But it's often how it goes for those of us who obey God. When we do what's right, there are going to be people who don't like it. Doing what's right is not a guarantee that life is going to be smooth sailing. In fact, Paul said this on one occasion: everyone who wants to live a godly life, in other words, everyone who wants to do what's right, are going to be persecuted. Now, I want to speak a word in Saul's defense here, and I can't believe I'm even thinking about doing this. But I'm just trying to put us on the pages of this with him, on equal footing here. We know that the Spirit of the Lord has left Saul now, right? And in the place of the Spirit, an evil spirit has come to torment him. But even without that, this would be a tough situation to find yourself in, wouldn't it? Put yourself in the place of Saul. Wouldn't this be a tough place? How many of us would be able to hear all this kind of adulation for somebody else? And we're the king. How many of us would not feel anything about that? David does later. Yeah. Saul just doesn't get that. He doesn't have a relationship with God, and so he doesn't get it. And so Saul, though, think about this. He goes from numero uno in Israel. I mean, remember when he became king? Man, the people were idolizing him. But he goes from numero uno to numero dos in the blink of an eye. And I think that if we were in that situation, that it would challenge us, wouldn't it? Yes, through prayer and through reliance on the Holy Spirit, hopefully we could overcome it. But I think most of us would still feel this to some degree. And unfortunately for David, Saul was neither spiritual nor humble at this point. He wasn't either one. And so it's more than he can handle. And his madness is going to make David's life miserable for the next 12 to 15 years. He's going to make David the object of his jealousy. And David's going to be a fugitive who is on the run for his own life. The Native Americans have a saying, the hated looks upon the hater and watches him destroy himself. Can you see that? The hated looks upon the hater and watches him destroy himself. Saul's hatred and Saul's desire to destroy David are going to lead to his own destruction. So there were these two shop owners who were in great competition with each other. They were rivals. And one night an angel appeared to one of the shop owners, and the angel said, I will give you anything you ask, but you must understand that whatever you ask for, your rival's going to receive double that. If you want to be rich, your rival will be twice as rich. If you want long life and good health, your rival's going to be healthier and live longer. So what is it that you would like for me to grant? And the shop owner thought about it for a minute, and he said, make me blind in one eye. The hated watches the hater destroy himself. Jealousy is so dangerous. I used to try and make a distinction between jealousy and envy, and they are different words in Greek. I used to think that envy came from a rotten heart, and jealousy is often motivated by love. And I took that from the fact that the Old Testament does say God is a jealous God. And I do think jealousy can have a positive side to it. But I really think these two words are much more synonymous than I once did. They're used interchangeably a lot. But it's so dangerous. And Saul's suspicion shackled him in a self-imposed prison. His consuming goal in life becomes twisted by fear and even paranoia. Instead of leading Israel on to bigger and better things, he is consumed with making David's life miserable. Which leads to the third problem of jealousy. That's right. And schizophrenia even. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Yeah. Yep. He missed all that. He was sick. But it leads us to our third problem with jealousy, and that is that jealousy will cause us to strike out at others. It says, the next day an evil spirit from God came forcefully on Saul. He was prophesying in his house. I don't get that, okay? I'll just tell you that right now. I don't get it. It doesn't even seem to fit here. But he was prophesying in his house while David was playing the lyre as he usually did. Saul had a spear in his hand, and he hurled it, saying to himself, "I'll pin David to the wall." But David eluded him twice. Okay, automatically, I'm almost thinking this has got to be a comedy. Okay? I'll get to that in just a minute. But the way this text reads, it seems as if this is immediately falling right after the Goliath event. It says the next day. That's when this paranoia begins. Saul's in one of his dark moods. David's there to play the harp for him, which he had been doing even before the Goliath event. And so I wonder, why does Saul have a spear in his hand while David's sitting there playing his lyre? So he just keep that, but is that his security blanket? Does he just keep his spear in his hand all the time? But this evil spirit comes forcefully upon him, and he tries to pin David to the wall. And this just seems strange to me. Because if someone throws a spear at me and misses, I'm not staying around to give him a second chance. I think this just shows how submissive David is to the king. But I don't get it. Would you hang around to allow someone to throw a spear at you a second time? Okay. You know, I've heard of musicians, and David is one, I've heard of musicians having people throw rotten tomatoes at them. But you start throwing a spear at me if I'm playing, I'm out of there. I don't even know what that means, that he's prophesying, because he has no connection with God at this point. I don't know. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that makes more sense to me. He's just raving mad. And I do think there's something, I've seen it in other places too, this Hebrew word that's often translated prophesying can mean more than our typical way of thinking. It could be like a babbling kind of a thing, okay? That would be my guess. Yeah, that's true. I'm with you. But let's wait and see how this story unfolds, because Saul's even going to turn against his own son. This is about Saul. Saul is all in it for himself. So, jealousy will eventually lead us to strike out at other people. Jealousy starts on the inside, but it doesn't stay there. And such a person may not have a spear in their hand, but they may have daggers in their eyes. And they may not throw a physical weapon, but they can strike out in other ways, can't they? Ugly words, hurtful actions. But here's the thing, jealousy will lead to fear. The fear of being left out, the fear of someone else receiving the attention, the fear of someone else getting the credit or honor, the fear of being discounted or overlooked. And tragically, it will keep one from being able to see God at work. And Casey, you kind of touched on this, but it will keep you from being able to see what God's doing. Look at what this says. Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with David but had departed from Saul. So he sent David away from him and gave him command over 1,000 men, and David led the troops in their campaigns. In everything he did, he had great success. Who would this also reflect upon? If he would allow it to, it would reflect upon Saul. Thank you. In everything, he had great success because the Lord was with him. When Saul saw how, try saying that 6 times. When Saul saw how successful he was afraid of him. But all Israel and Judah loved David because he had led them in their campaigns. Interesting, Saul's the one throwing the spear, but Saul's the one living in fear. I didn't mean to rhyme that. That's pretty good when you can just do that. You know, you got to give me some credit there. He's afraid because he knows that the Lord has left him, but the Lord is with David. And he keeps giving David these promotions. Do you think there may be an ulterior motive to that? He may be hoping David gets killed. Because this is, I agree with you, because this is early. This is not after David's even, other than the Goliath event, he hadn't proven himself in military campaigns. But he ends up giving David the military experience that David will need when he's king. So even as Saul tries to work against David, God is using that for David. And so today, we've seen Jonathan's love for David. We've seen Saul's jealousy of David. And we've seen Saul's resulting fear of David. And it illustrates us a very simple truth that I shared with you at the beginning of class. That love brings us closer to people while jealousy and fear drive us apart. And the end result, I don't know if maybe someone in here, and believe me, I'm not thinking of anybody. I'm just believing that God can work in things like this as we're gathered here. The end result of being consumed by jealousy or envy, the end result of being consumed by fear is isolation. People will pull away. And it results in living a miserable life. Saul is Exhibit A. So, anything? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And apparently you were in a different place in your life by then to be able to appreciate that more. Yeah. Yeah, it certainly feels better, doesn't it? Okay. Let's pray. Father, please convince us of the danger of living our lives in comparison, living our lives in jealousy and envy. And really, as it just is an epidemic in our culture right now, please help us to see the danger of living lives in fear. Lord, you have conquered. You're the victor. And you've called us to be on your side. What do we have to fear? So convict us deep in our hearts about that. And let us release that and live in peace and live in joy. Man, I'm so grateful we get to come today, Father, and gather here as your people and worship you. And I pray that we'll be able to do that with hearts that are wide open to receive whatever you bring. And may we do everything